Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us here today for the third and final segment of our three-part series, SEFARAD, Slavery, Legacy, and Modern Reflections. Also, I'd like to wish all you moms out there a happy Mother's Day, and thank you for making it on Mother's Day. Thank you so much. My name is Michael Steinberger. I am founder and CEO of Jewish Heritage Alliance, a nonprofit platform dedicated to research, preserve, and most importantly, to promote the legacy of SEFARAD, referring to the Jews who lived and were expelled from the Iberian Peninsula, nowadays Spain and Portugal. In order to broaden our scope and expand our reach, we developed a strategic alliance of partners consisting of global organizations, institutions, and individuals covering the private and public sectors that together create a voice of the collective, thereby amplifying our message. At this time, I would like to acknowledge and thank our co-sponsors who helped make today's presentation possible. I'd like to thank the Leonard Miller Center for Contemporary Judaic Studies and the George Fieldingrease Program of Judaic Studies in the University of Miami. I also would like to thank Congregation Mikveh Israel by way of the late scholar Herman Prince Solomon. I would also like to thank and acknowledge our co-hosting partners for helping promote today's event. They are the Greater Miami Jewish Federation, the Center for Advancements of Jewish Education, also in Miami, known as SAGE, Honor Museum of the Jewish People, the Society for Crypto-Judaic Studies, the European Jewish Community Center, and the Women's International Zionist Organization of Florida, also referred to as WITSEL. Please note that any of you that would like to have you or your organization sponsor our events, feel free to contact us and we would absolutely like to accommodate you. I would like to say that we are extremely proud to have taken on this somewhat controversial, if not sensitive topic, and framed it from a proper perspective. That is to say that slavery had a whole different connotation or meaning in the early part of world history. It is also noteworthy to say that the Jews helped and participated in the fight to end slavery, including here in the United States. You, the audience, we ask you to please insert any questions you may have exclusively in the Q&A section of this webinar. We will try to get to as many of them as we can. Those that we cannot, we will actually send you an email with an answer. So at this time, I would like to introduce today's moderator, my friend and colleague, Dr. Isaac Amon, the Director of Academic Search at Jewish Heritage Alliance. Dr. Amon is an attorney and counselor at law. He was a legal fellow at the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia in The Hague, legislative director at the Missouri Department of Corrections, and an ISIS war crimes investigator. He is an adjunct professor at Washington University School of Law in St. Louis, Missouri. And this past summer, he was a scholar in residence at Oxford University through the Institute for the Study of Global Anti-Semitism and Policy. A proud grandson of Ashkenazi and Sephardic immigrants, he often speaks on the law, international criminal justice, and Jewish memory, including anti-Semitism and the Inquisition and the Holocaust. At this time, I turn it over to Isaac. Please take it away, Isaac.
Thank you, Michael. Ladies and gentlemen, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever you may be, and welcome to today's webinar, part 3 of a 3-part series on slavery, legacy, and modern reflections. This series has explored the intersecting histories of slavery and Sephardic Jewish communities, shaped by the themes of exile, displacement, survival, and the struggle for freedom. These stories, spanning oceans, continents, and deep contradictions, often don't make it into the mainstream historical narrative. Today, in this final webinar, from the Declaration of Independence to the Civil War, we will focus on a critical period in American history, from the founding of the United States through the country's most devastating conflict, or the period of time spanning from President George Washington through the assassination of President Abraham Lincoln, or in the American Jewish world from the lifetime of the Reverend Gershom Mendes Seixas, spiritual leader of Congregation Shereth Israel, the Spanish and Portuguese synagogue in New York City, to that of his son-in-law, Abraham Jonas, a well-known lawyer and politician in Illinois, and a person whom Abraham Lincoln famously called, quote, one of my most valued friends, end quote. The timing of this last webinar is particularly meaningful as it takes place during Jewish American Heritage Month, a time dedicated to celebrating the diverse stories of Jewish Americans and reflecting on their extraordinary and enduring contributions to American society, history, and culture. This month reminds us of the complexity of our shared history, as indeed this entire series is aimed to do. And this month is a perfect moment for us to engage with these overlooked stories of Jewish Americans, particularly the Sephardic Jewish experience amid the wider context of slavery and race in the early American Republic. From the founding of the country through the Civil War and beyond, life was shaped by the promises and contradictions of liberty, freedom, and human bondage. While the Declaration of Independence had famously proclaimed all men are created equal, millions of enslaved Africans remained in captivity, and Jewish communities were themselves navigating complex issues of race, power, and identity in a rapidly changing society. Today, we'll explore that complexity. We'll hear about figures like Moses Michael Hayes, David Levy Yulee, and Judah P. Benjamin, Jewish figures whose lives challenge us still to think more deeply about issues of identity, morality, and heritage. This is a conversation that is vital to understanding the legacies of slavery, diaspora, and faith that continue to resonate in our country as we commemorate both the 250th anniversary of the beginning of the American Revolution and the 160th anniversary of the end of the Civil War amid a global surge of anti-Semitism unprecedented since the Holocaust. Accordingly, ladies and gentlemen, as we take this important journey together, let's remember that Jewish American Heritage Month is about recognizing the fullness of Jewish history, its joys and struggles, its triumphs and challenges, and understanding how the past continues to shape our present and how we can learn from choices made by those who came before. To help guide us, today we're joined by two incredibly distinguished panelists who bring deep knowledge of American history, race, and Jewish identity. We're grateful to have them with us for what promises to be a meaningful and thought-provoking conversation. And with that, I now have the pleasure of introducing our first speaker, Dr. Paul Finkelman, who was with us in part one. Professor Finkelman is professor at the University of Toledo College of Law, a specialist in American legal history, constitutional law, and race in the law. He is the author of more than 225 scholarly articles and more than 50 books. His work has also appeared in the New York Times, Washington Post, and the Jewish Review of Books. The United States Supreme Court has quoted or cited him in 6 decisions, and I'm proud to call him a colleague, mentor, and an overall inspiration. Paul, I turn it over to you.
For some reason, my video is not showing up. I will try to fix that immediately here. I thank you very much, Isaac. It is a delight to be here, and I hope the technology is working correctly. This is not an easy subject, and that's the first thing that we need to think about when we think about Jews and American slavery. Most American Jews have little or no knowledge about the relationship between Jews and slavery in the United States or elsewhere. And quite frankly, most Jews are surprised or even shocked to discover that there were Jewish slave owners. But there were. And my goal here is not to make people uncomfortable or unhappy, but to explain the complexity of Jewish history and Jews in America. We start, of course, with the Jews who were expelled from Spain and Portugal, going to Holland, some going to England, some going to the Caribbean, and in the early 1600s, joining a Dutch invasion of what is today Brazil and creating a Dutch colony around the city of Recife, Brazil. When that colony is when the Dutch are forced to leave that colony as the Portuguese who had conquered Brazil push back, most of the Jews immediately leave and go back to Holland. A small handful of them, as we know, end up in New Amsterdam, and they will be the first Jews to come to what is the United States. Now, all of the Jews who are in the Brazilian colony, the Dutch Brazilian colony, are in a colony where slavery is the central economic institution. They are not unfamiliar with slavery. It is everywhere in the Atlantic world. And again, one of the things to contemplate is the fact that if you traveled anywhere in North or South America, or almost anywhere in Western Europe, you would find slavery, you would find the African slave trade. It is an ongoing, powerful institution. Ultimately, about 12.5 million Africans will be brought to the New World, most of them to Latin America and the Caribbean. Only a small number of that 12.5 million, about 500,000, will end up in what is today the United States. The Jews who live in this world are in this world, and they participate in this world. At the same time, there are some interesting challenges and changes that we might not expect. A Jewish scholar at the City University of New York did a survey of all of the ships coming to the British colony of Barbados, and he discovered that about 45,000 slaves were brought to Barbados itself. He tracked the ownership of all these ships, and as it turned out, of the 45,000 or more slaves coming to Barbados, only 128 of them came on ships where there were Jewish investments. Again, it's important to understand that the African slave trade is very complicated. Most ships are not single-person ventures, although Keith Stoke will talk about a few that were. Most are what we would today call a limited liability corporation. Various investors put money into the ship. If the ship is successful, excuse me, if the voyage is successful, then everybody will make a lot of money. And if the voyage is a failure, you will only lose what you invested in. The voyages are dangerous. Ships sink. There are sometimes diseases that kill many of the slaves on the ship, who are being treated as property to be sold. But what's fascinating is that Jews in Britain and in the Caribbean tend to shy away from investing in the African slave trade. It does not mean that they don't buy slaves, because they do. Almost every middle-class family in any city of any size in North America will own slaves if they can. Jews are no strangers to this. In addition, there are investments in sugar plantations in Barbados and Jamaica, and Jews invest in those plantations and they own slaves. There are Jews who move to South Carolina and Georgia and become large slave owners as well. So this is the world where the American Revolution begins approximately 250 years ago, right now. Remember, the revolution begins on April 19th, 1775, at the Battle of Lexington and Concord. In 1775, slavery is legal in every single one of the American colonies. There is no place from what is today Maine to what is today Georgia where you cannot find people who are held as slaves who are bought and sold. A couple of the major slave trading centers are Charleston and Savannah, and there are early Jewish communities in both those cities. There are also early Jewish communities in Philadelphia, New York, and Newport. So it shouldn't surprise us that Jews are involved in owning slaves, in buying and selling slaves, not as slave traders, not as people who buy large numbers of slaves and move them from place to place, but rather as owners of what are property, and that's what we have to understand, who buy and sell the property they have. I recently went to the American Jewish Archives in Cincinnati, which is one of the largest repositories of data and documents and letters and account books of the history of American Jews. There I found more than 1,000 entries in the records of the city of Charleston involving Jews. Somebody painstakingly went through all the records in Charleston to look for Jewish names. I am sure they used as their database the members of the early Jewish synagogue in Charleston. And each of these pages that I went through, and I went through literally hundreds and hundreds of pages, there would be 5 or 6 or 7 descriptions of some legal act, a marriage, a divorce, a property sale, a will being probated. And on almost every one of them, there were indications of Jews buying and selling slaves, giving slaves away, once in a while freeing their slaves, but not always, and not very often, in fact. Um, at the beginning of the revolution, there is the beginning of a change in the way people relate to slavery. In 1780, Pennsylvania passes a law to gradually end slavery in that new independent state. In 1780, Massachusetts passes a new constitution which says all men are born free and equal, and that leads to the Massachusetts courts in 1781, just a year later, saying that slavery is no longer legal in Massachusetts. In Pennsylvania, there is an organization formed called the Pennsylvania Society for the Abolition of Slavery. The first president is Benjamin Franklin. Um, most of the people involved in the anti-slavery movement at this time are Quakers or Mennonites, or in England or in New England, Congregationalists. There are also Huguenots. But the majority of Americans are not involved in anti-slavery. We do find a couple of Jewish residents of Philadelphia and New York who become involved in the anti-slavery societies of those places. These are very Christian organizations, and in fact, many of them are clearly motivated by Christian religious ideas that you should do unto others. But nevertheless, Moses Judah, a leader of Shereth Israel in New York City, joins the New York Anti-Slavery Society and serves on a number of committees and becomes a big player in the organization. Benjamin Nones, who had owned slaves for most of his adult life, frees his slaves and joins the Pennsylvania Abolition Society. Other members of the synagogue in Philadelphia, Mikveh Israel, include Mordecai. Obviously, the family is not very creative about first and last names, but Mordecai, Jonas Phillips, Moses Myers, and Isaac Myers free their own slaves, and they become involved in the manumission, that is the voluntary freeing of other slaves. These early anti-slavery Jews are a minority within their community, but in that sense, they reflect the entire community of America at the time, because most Americans, white Americans, are not involved in anti-slavery. They are not thinking about it. And there are interesting contrast. So when Moses Judah in New York is actively fighting slavery, his Chazan in Shereth Israel, Emmanuel Nunez Cavallo, owns 3 slaves and buys at least one more when he later moves to take a position in Charleston. Jewish slave owners are, in a sense, like their white neighbors. The first Jew elected to a legislature in America is elected in 1774, before the revolution actually starts. He is a man named Francis Salvador, who is a Sephardic Jew who owns slaves in South Carolina. He will later be elected to the first official legislature of the new state of South Carolina, and he will then die in combat fighting the British. He is probably the first Jew to die fighting in the revolution. So throughout this period, we have this contrast. Jews owning slaves, a small number of Jews, just like the small number of Christians in America, are joining anti-slavery societies and freeing their slaves. The most important early Jewish American politician was Mordecai Manuel Noah. Noah has 1 Sephardi grandparent and 3 Ashkenazi grandparents, but he always affiliates with Sephardi synagogues and proclaims his Sephardic ancestry. He grows up in South Carolina, where he studies law. He fully embraces the racial notions of South Carolina and of slavery. He does not appear to have personally owned slaves, but as a long political leader, he is supportive of slavery, and he is a vigorous opponent of Black freedom. At the same time, for a short time, he is the U.S. envoy to Algeria, where he tries to get white Christian American sailors released from their slavery in Algeria. This is, of course, because at the time, some of the North African nations would capture European or American ships and enslave the sailors because they were not Muslim. So Noah is fighting slavery when it's the enslavement of white people, but he has got no problem with the enslavement of black people. Of course, that fits perfectly well with his political party because Thomas Jefferson, the leader of his party, known as the Democratic Republicans, owns about 200 slaves. James Monroe, James Madison, other leaders of the party are also slave owners. And indeed, the first New York president, Martin Van Buren, who comes from a state which has abolished slavery by the time he is president, had owned slaves as a young man growing up in upstate New York, in Kinderhook, New York, which is just outside of Albany. So this is one way of looking at the picture of Jews and slavery. I want to focus on a couple of important political leaders who are Sephardi and who are very important in the development of American history at this time. The first Jewish congressman is elected in 1844, Louis Charles Levin from the city of Philadelphia, and he represents Pennsylvania. He had also been raised in South Carolina and has a long connection with slaveholding Southerners, and he is their ally in Congress. Levin never lifts a finger to oppose the continued existence of slavery in America. He does, however, weirdly perhaps, join an anti-immigration party. Levin is opposed to Catholic immigration, even though he is himself a Jewish person and therefore very much a minority in his own world. The first Jewish U.S. senator, I often ask this when I give a talk in public, I'd say, does anyone know where the first Jewish U.S. senator comes from? And people will say New York, Pennsylvania, sometimes California. Well, it turns out it's Florida. And it's in 1845. When Florida becomes a new state, the very first person elected to the Senate from Florida is David Levy Yulee. He is a Sephardic Jew. His family had been tied to the Sephardic community in Morocco before they moved to the New World. He is a lawyer. He is a planter. He is a militiaman in the Second Seminole War. And by the time he goes to Congress as a senator, he owns 80 slaves in Florida. He is a railroad promoter and a visionary. There is a Levy County in Florida. There is a Yulee County in Florida. And probably very few people know that these are both named for the first senator who was Jewish. David Levy was born on the island of St. Thomas. During British occupation, it later reverted to Danish ownership. His grandfather, Elihu Halevi ibn Yulee, was a royal merchant and an advisor to the Sultan of Morocco. So Levy comes from a long tradition of slaveholding communities. He brings that with him to the Caribbean, brings that with him to Florida. Ironically, his father is an early opponent of slavery and one of the few Southerners who opposes slavery in the period when Florida is a territory. So that is David Levy Yulee. He later marries a Christian woman and a woman named Nancy Wycliffe, who is the daughter of a former Kentucky governor, and that's a very good political marriage. He ceases to be Jewish by the time of his death, but he is clearly a Jew for most of his life, and he is always seen as Jewish, even when he attends an Episcopal church. The second Jewish senator is more famous. The second Jewish senator is Judah P. Benjamin. What do we know about Benjamin? He is from the Caribbean. His family, again, is Sephardic. They moved to South Carolina. He grows up in Charleston, a slaveholding city. He attends Yale. At this point, if Benjamin had been opposed to slavery, he probably would have remained in the North somewhere where slavery was being eradicated. Instead, he goes from Yale to New Orleans, which is the largest city in the South and a center of slavery. And in New Orleans, Judah Benjamin becomes a very powerful senator, a very powerful lawyer, and a very wealthy man. And at one point owns a plantation with 147 slaves. I used to believe that Judah Benjamin was the largest slave owning Jew in the American South, but recent work has discovered that there is a man named Solomon Cohen Sr., actually. He is also Sephardi, and like many Sephardis, he names his son after himself. So there's a Solomon Cohen Sr., Solomon Cohen Jr. Solomon Cohen Sr. in Georgetown, South Carolina, may have owned as many as 800 slaves. His son, Solomon Cohen Jr., will move to Savannah, where he will be an owner of more than 20 slaves, as will his brother, who also moves to Savannah. Solomon Cohen Jr. will become a lawyer, a leader in his community, a leader of the Confederacy, a strong supporter of Confederate secession, a strong supporter of the Civil War, and a strong supporter of slavery until the day he dies. Again, illustrating the complexity of the world I'm talking about, Solomon Cohen Jr. marries the niece of the very famous Jewish leader of Philadelphia, Rebecca Gratz, and of course also the niece of Hyman Gratz, who was a Jewish philanthropist. Rebecca Gratz's niece grows up in Philadelphia. She clearly opposes slavery, like everyone else in the Gratz family by this time. But when she moves to Savannah, she ultimately becomes comfortable with slavery, and by the end of her life, bitterly objects to the end of slavery. The irony of the Cohens in Savannah is that their eldest son, named Gratz Cohen, so he takes his mother's maiden name of Gratz as a first name. So he is Gratz Cohen. Gratz Cohen is one of the last Confederate soldiers to die in the Civil War. So this Jewish family not only supports slavery, but they sacrifice their own son to create the slaveholding Confederate Republic. After the Civil War, Solomon Cohen Jr. will be elected to Congress by the people in Georgia. He will not be seated because he is a Confederate, and that's sort of the end of his political career. But this again illustrates the enormous complexity of things. Now let me turn to the flip side of this. Most early Jews are not involved in politics. Mordecai Manuel Noah is an exception. And most early Jews say little or nothing about slavery. They live in the South, they own slaves. They live in the North, they don't, but they aren't actively anti-slavery. However, from 1840 to 1865, about 150,000 Jews moved to the United States, mostly from Central Europe, Germany, what is today Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Austria. And many of these are people who are fleeing the failed liberal revolutions of the 1840s. They are known as 48ers because of that. Some of them will serve as military officers, including a couple of generals in the U.S. Army during the Civil War. They mostly go to northern cities or to the Upper South. So some of them go to Baltimore, Louisville, and St. Louis. Others end up in northern cities. The most famous family of this migration is the Brandeis family, which moves to Louisville, where their son is born, Louis T. Brandeis, who will, of course, become the first Jewish member of the U.S. Supreme Court. Louis Brandeis is originally named Louis David Brandeis, but he changes his middle name to Dembitz to honor his uncle. His uncle, Louis Dembitz, translates Uncle Tom's Cabin into German. Now, Uncle Tom's Cabin is the most important anti-slavery book ever written, and it's very, very famous. And him translating into German shows his commitment to opposition to slavery. When John Brown is riding in Kansas and fighting to prevent Kansas from becoming a slave state, there are two young Jewish immigrants who are riding with him. I was really surprised when I found this out. One doesn't expect Jews out there fighting a mini civil war in Kansas. One of them is Theodore Weiner, who recently came from Poland, and August Bondy, a recent immigrant from Bohemia. Bondy will later serve in the 5th Kansas Cavalry during the Civil War, and then he will be elected to public office and have a long political career in Kansas after the Civil War. Bondy is obviously not being elected by the Jewish vote in Kansas. He is being elected because he's a Civil War hero, a veteran, and he's smart, and he gets elected. One more piece, and then we will turn this over to my colleague and good friend, Keith Stokes. I want to talk about the great rabbinic debate over slavery on the eve of the Civil War. In February 1860, Dr. Morris Jacob Raphael, who is the rabbi at New York congregation B'nai Yeshurun, becomes the first rabbi in American history to give the opening prayer at a session of Congress. Congress is controlled by Southerners. There is a pro-slavery Northern president from Pennsylvania, James Buchanan. Raphael is a loyal supporter of these people, and he never attacks slavery, thinks slavery is okay, and will ultimately write a very long sermon, not the one he gives at Congress, but another one, arguing that slavery is consistent with biblical law, although he has some criticisms of the way slavery is practiced in the American South. But he is a pro-slavery rabbi from New York, and there are two Jews who immediately respond to Raphael. One is Michael Halprin, a Jewish scholar and journalist who had fled Hungary after the failed Hungarian Revolution. And he writes an editorial saying that Raphael is basically a disgrace to the Jewish people. More importantly is David Einhorn. David Einhorn is a German-trained, ordained Reform rabbi, one of the first ordained Reform rabbis in the United States. He is the rabbi at Har Sinai in Baltimore, which is a very large Reform congregation. And Einhorn gives a sermon in German attacking Raphael and attacking the idea that the Bible supports slavery or that Jews support slavery. This sermon is translated into English and circulated, and Einhorn is basically forced to leave Baltimore when the Civil War begins. He runs to nearby Philadelphia, where he becomes the rabbi at Congregation Knesset Israel in Philadelphia, where I was a member for a number of years when I taught in Philadelphia. And Knesset Israel becomes known as the Abolitionist Temple. So here we have the conflicts, I suppose, within the Jewish community. If we look at the whole picture, most American Jews say nothing about slavery at all, but the significant number of American Jews who live in the South, while they are not usually actively supporting slavery, they own slaves, and many of them, like Solomon Cohen and Solomon Cohen Jr. and Solomon Cohen Jr.'s brother, own significant numbers of slaves. One more Jewish immigrant tells the complexity of the story. In the Late 1820s, a recent PhD from Germany named Francis Lieber moves to the United States. He tries to get a job teaching at a university in the North, Columbia, Harvard, Yale, Princeton. Nobody wants this German immigrant. He ends up teaching at South Carolina College, which is today the University of South Carolina. When he arrives there, he is made a full professor of political economy, which today would be a cross between political science, sociology, and economics. And he has a nice middle class home with his wife. He needs servants. In those days, you need servants to run a middle class home. There's no electricity, there's no indoor plumbing, there's no refrigeration. But he is personally opposed to slavery from day one. So he brings some of his nieces and cousins to South Carolina to be the servants in his home. This lasts about 2 years, and then he is told quite forcefully that in South Carolina, white women don't do this kind of work, particularly white relatives of the homeowner, and that he has to buy some slaves to run his house. Reluctantly, Lieber ends up owning a couple of house servants, although privately he condemns slavery and hates the idea that he's a slave owner. In the 1850s, he's effectively chased out of South Carolina, not because he is openly anti-slavery. He's smart enough not to do that because he would get fired if he did, but rather because he's not sufficiently pro-slavery. And so Lieber goes to New York. He gets a position this time at Columbia University, where he teaches political science, political economy. And during the Civil War, Lieber will be the legal brains of the War Department. And Lieber will write a book called the Lieber Code, which is the official code for the U.S. Army fighting the Civil War on how the Army is to behave. And a number of places in that code, Lieber says that slavery is a violation of human rights, it's a violation of international law, and that American troops should free any slaves they encounter. So the irony of South Carolina's closed society and its oppression of Lieber because he wasn't sufficiently pro-slavery is that Lieber helps create the document that will lead the Union Army to be the greatest army of liberation in the history of the world, as Sherman marches from Vicksburg to Atlanta to Charleston and up the coast into North Carolina, perhaps liberating as many as 1 million people from bondage. And they will be doing it by following the Lieber Code. And so that's the complex story of Jews and slaveholding in American history. Thank you very much. And now I happily return this to my friend Isaac, who will introduce our next speaker.
Thank you very much, Paul, for that incredible overview and beginning of the program. Our next speaker is Mr. Keith Stokes, who received his undergraduate degree from Cornell University and did his formative graduate work at the University of Chicago. Woven into his formal education are ancestral stories of a time before the American Revolution, which provide him with the truly unique lens to see the present. Keith currently leads the state of Rhode Island's Division of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion, and his prolific past experience includes serving as director of the City of Providence Department of Business and Economic Development, executive director of the Economic Development Corporation of Rhode Island, and Newport County Chamber of Commerce executive director, and most recently he was named Historian Laureate of Rhode Island. Keith, the background is remarkable. And we're honored to have you with us today alongside Paul. And with that, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Isaac. Good afternoon, everyone. I have the challenge of providing about 500 years of Jewish and African shared history in about 15 or 20 minutes. So I'll attempt to do that. This presentation, which we entitle Shared Spaces, is going to be really presenting this history from a unique perspective of the early settlement of both Sephardic Jews and enslaved Africans in early Newport, Rhode Island. In fact, one of the things that we're quite proud here in Newport is that we're not only one of the most historic communities in early America, but today, in 2025, Newport contains the largest concentration of pre-American Revolutionary War structures, nearly 400 structures that still exist. Many of those structures were once lived, worked, and worshiped in by early arriving Jews and enslaved and free Africans. And we're going to spend a few minutes talking about that story and that shared space that they had. Now, in doing that, I think one of the most important aspects in presenting this history is differentiating between what commonly people refer to as integration, a process where it's an adaptation, an assimilation by one or two or multiple cultures to create a new culture within a society. Well, that's not the case. And it certainly was not the case of early arriving Jews and enslaved Africans. In fact, the spaces that they shared, the lives that they shared, is more today recognized as interdependence, meaning that both entities shared spaces, lives, work, pushing for freedom and their ability to worship, but interdependent from each other. And at no time was either group looking to assimilate or to integrate. So a very important aspect of understanding. And I hope you carry forward this understanding as we talk about this presentation. When we talk about early African heritage and Jewish worship, it's as part of the early foundings of the Americas in the Western Hemisphere, and certainly at the time British North America, today the United States of America. And in both cases, they're both closely associated with the late 15th century Spanish Inquisition. In fact, what you'll find is that many of the Sephardic Jews that are cast out of Spain and Portugal and follow into the New World are almost landing simultaneously in those countries and large centers, maritime centers, that were actively engaged in African enslavement and transatlantic slave trading. And in fact, in the case of Newport, Newport during the colonial period embodies this irony, an irony that we call today an American irony, a place that's being established as religious freedom, but also rising up as the most significant slave trading center in British North America, and all going on at the same time at the very founding period of America. And I think it's important to recognize when we talk about the African diaspora, we'll talk about the African diaspora first and the Jewish diaspora to the Atlantic world or the Western Hemisphere. And Paul pointed this out very accurately. During nearly a 3.5 century period, when enslaved Africans were being transported from the old world, the African continent, to the new world, the Western Hemisphere, we now know that over that period of time, at least 12.5 million enslaved African men, women, and children would land into the new world. Out of that number of 12.5 million, nearly half would land in South America, Latin America, and the West Indies. In the case of British North America, it's little less than 500,000, a very small percentage. But what's most important to recognize is the outsized role that certainly Newport, Rhode Island plays for British North America at that time. And just to give you a sense of some of the really outsized activity of Newport at that time, Newport, which is the capital city of Rhode Island at that time, between 1705 and 1807, Rhode Island merchants, largely in Newport, are actively engaged in nearly 1,000 slave voyages. This is the largest number for British North America. It's nowhere near the numbers of the West Indies or South or Central America, but for British North America, Newport is at the center of the British North American slave trade. In fact, we actually have a database of close to 934 of those documented slave voyages. Of those voyages, they're almost largely arriving in what is today Ghana and northern Nigeria. It would have been called the Gold Coast at that time, but many of the Africans, in many cases, were taken from the Akan-speaking people of Ghana or the Yoruba-speaking people of Nigeria. And most of those Africans, today we recognize as forced immigrants because they're bringing more than just their labor, they're bringing their culture, their language, their religion, like any immigrant. Many of them would eventually land in the West Indies in Central America, but a few would eventually be taken from the West Indies and eventually arrive in the shores of Newport itself. And at the time of this African diaspora, it's important to recognize it almost is beginning almost simultaneously with the Jewish diaspora to the Atlantic world. In fact, The date we know, the August 1st of 1492, the Alhambra Decree, where close to 250,000 Jews are being expelled from the Spanish kingdom, initially in Spain, then later in Portugal. What's most important to recognize is that King Ferdinand and Queen Isabel the Catholic that institute the Alhambra Decree are also, by 1501, King Ferdinand is the first European monarchy that also engages the use of enslaved Africans as a part of the Spanish settlement in the New World. So what you begin to see by the end of the 15th century and expanding the 16th century, you're seeing those Jews that are forced out of the former Spain and Portugal, now Catholic kingdoms, and they're arriving in the New World. They're landing in locations which are a part of the early settlement of the Spanish, the Portuguese, the Dutch, the French, the English. But most importantly, it's those Jews that follow the Dutch that are allowed to maintain their Jewish identity and Jewish religion. And this plays a very important role for those Sephardic Jews as they arrive in the New World. And what's most important in recognizing this is the footprint that these Jews live behind. Much of those footprints still shared and are still visible to this day. The early Jewish settlements in the 16th and 17th and accelerating into the 18th century are places like Brazil at Recife. You see them in Jamaica. You see them in the case of New Amsterdam, which is today New York, the first Jewish settlement in British North America, Congregation Shareth Israel. Later, you see a second congregation at Newport. And then even more importantly, these Jews that are settling here, those that are following the Dutch and those that are arriving in Dutch strongholds are able to actively worship and actually actively engage their lives as early Jews. In the case of Newport, the first Jews that arrive are as early as 1658. They arrive from Barbados. And what's most important is at the time of their arrival, only 20 families, they're already beginning to test the majority government and the majority Christian community that would they have the ability to stay and remain as non-Christian majorities. And in fact, in 1684, several Jewish leaders in Newport petitioned the Rhode Island General Assembly at Newport and asked a simple question: can we remain as non-Christians and as Israelites? And the Rhode Island General Assembly recognized this and said, you can remain, even though you are a stranger to our colony, but you can remain, you can be unmolested in your religion as long as you're obedient to His Majesty's laws. So what these Jews had asked for in Newport by the end of the 17th century, and what they were looking for and what they received, was not religious freedom, it's toleration. We just certainly want to live in a place where we can live and work and prosper and eventually worship freely, but not have to look over our shoulder based upon the wings of a king or a queen or a now royal governor. So what begins to happen in Newport is extraordinary for early Jews. They are openly exercising their worship and beliefs as Jews in the New World. And in fact, and we'll talk about this in a few minutes, many of the historic properties that still exist in Newport today are where early Jews in the 17th and 18th century lived, worked, and worshiped, and eventually died. So I want to talk a little bit about what we call our golden age, because this golden age of Newport between the beginning of the 18th century up until the time of the American Revolution, that is a time when Newport, along with Philadelphia, Boston, and Charleston and New York, are the largest British North American seaports. Newport is number 4 as far as the number of ships, its transactions, and its activity. So Newport is at the center of this golden age as a maritime economy. And it's important to realize that at that time, Newport is now attracting additional Jewish families. This is one of the few places where they can worship freely. They're not citizens, they're not franchised, they're not naturalized, but they're not looking for that. They're simply looking for a place where they can exercise their economic opportunities and raise their families under the religion of their choice and the religion of their ancestors. And as these Jews arrive from all over the diaspora, they're bringing with them not only their sense of worship and belief in their Jewish heritage, they're bringing their economies, they're bringing their commerce. In fact, one of the interesting aspects of allowing at least religious diversity at that time, it begins to attract men and women and families who bring not only their belief in worship, but also they bring their customs, they bring their commerce, and they bring their worldwide connections. So what you begin to see in Newport, unlike anywhere else, where Jews are arriving and establishing themselves, along with Quakers. In fact, one of the earliest and dominant Quaker communities is Rhode Island at Newport. Newport today still has a 1699 existing Quaker meeting house. So as these families are arriving from all across the world, the diaspora, they're bringing their economies. And that golden age of Newport is largely tied to the diversity of economic opportunity and entrepreneurship. Jewish families are introducing into the Newport economy Castilian soap making, spermaceti candle making. In fact, the first American business cartel chartered in America is a United Spermaceti candle making company that is co-equally owned by Christian and Jewish merchants. Again, these are interdependent men. They're not looking to share religion. They're not looking to share culture. They're just looking to share economic prosperity. They're interdependent, not integrated. And it works very well during this golden age in Newport. It's also important to recognize that, again, Newport is also driven by a transatlantic trade, a world trade, the slave trade. And in fact, as I'd said earlier, Newport was the largest, for British North America, was the largest slave trading center. If I could bring you back to Newport by 1755, 20 years before the American Revolution, it's a population of 12,000 souls. Less than 100 are Jewish, but it's still prominent for early America at that time. Nearly 1/3 of the entire population of Newport at that time are enslaved and some free Africans. Only Charleston, South Carolina would have a larger percentage of enslaved to free at that time. It's also important to recognize the intersection between this religion and those who were arriving in Newport, both Christians and Jews who were religious minorities and persecuted. They're all engaged at some level or benefiting at some level of the slave trade. The slave trade is the prominent economy of Newport in early colonial America. And as you can see in this image here, some of the most significant slave traders and slave owners. Slave traders meaning they own or invest in slave vessels that are running from Newport to the Gold Coast and Grain Coast and Rice Coast of West Africa. They're taking enslaved men, women, and children and transporting them largely to the sugarcane, coffee, and tobacco fields of the West Indies, and then in some rare cases, bringing raw materials and some slaves back to Newport. Today, we recognize as the triangular trade. What's important to recognize is that the transatlantic slave trade and African enslavement was a worldwide equal opportunity employer. Every race, every ethnicity, every religion participated, some more adept than others. In the case of Jewish participation, if you were a Jewish merchant, you were involved in the trade. If you were not a Jewish merchant, you were less involved in the trade. And as you can see from this image here, in the case, Aaron Lopez, a Sephardic Jew who had arrived from Spain via Portugal to New York to Newport, his uncle and father-in-law, Jacob Reyes Rivera, who came from Seville, Spain, and then eventually to Amsterdam, to Newport. They represent two and a very small minority of the larger level of slave traders and slave participation by religion. In fact, my late Newport grandmother had a word for Quakers in Newport who were active slave traders. 1 foot in the counting house and 1 foot in the meeting house. And one Quaker woman in the 18th century made a very, I think, adept statement about so many pious religious men and women and families still involved in the slave trade, suggesting it's the custom of prosperity, of economic prosperity, that keep men blinded. But I want to point out that as much as we talk about slave trading and slave systems and its intersection on early religious persecuted minority people such as Jews, it's important to recognize that the Africans that arrived enslaved arrived more than chattel property. They're bringing with them not only their labor, but they're bringing their culture, their politics, their religion, their life, and their traditions. And in fact, most enslaved Africans would arrive generally to New England, but particularly to places like Rhode Island at Newport, originated from the Akan-speaking people of Ghana today. In fact, we have primary records of slave vessels owned and operated by Rhode Island merchants that are landing at Cape Coast Castle in today Ghana or Fort William at Ananabo, both still standing. So as these Africans arrive, unlike enslaved Africans arriving in other locations of the New World, they maintain their language, their customs, and more importantly, their ability to organize. So what we begin to see, starting by July 4th, 1776, today we recognize that as the Declaration of Independence, the separation of the British colonies from Great Britain and the establishment of the United States. Starting that year and over the next 10 to 12 years, every New England and Northern now becoming United States would either gradually or immediately abolish slavery. In the case of Rhode Island, it's 1784. By 1784, most of the enslaved African men, women, and children in Rhode Island, particularly in Newport, are already free. And as today, we recognize this as the first emancipation. It is not the Emancipation Proclamation of Abraham Lincoln during the American Civil War. It's not the end of the Civil War, which frees a balance of 4 million Africans, but it's this first emancipation by the end of the 18th century, where you have for the first time nearly 200,000 free African men, women, and children in the new United States of America. And in the case of Newport, these free Africans are now exercising their authority as free. In fact, on November 10th, 1780, we know this because we still have the original records, a group of free African tradesmen come together and they form the Free African Union Society. This society is the first of its kind. It sets up a burial society. It sets up a mutual aid society with an insurance fund. It raises money for those Africans who would like to return to Africa, and then eventually would raise funds to establish the first free African school in America, all before the American Civil War. And what's important is that these Africans are living freely and exercising their rights interdependently within a larger Jewish enclave within Newport. In fact, they build their first place of worship. Their second building still stands across the street where the Hazan, Isaac Turl and family lived and grew up as a part of their synagogue. So what you're beginning to see now is that by the early 19th century, unlike anywhere else in the Americas, places like Newport are now starting to see a significant rise in freedom and opportunity. I want to come back now to the early Jews based on several of the prominent families and some of the most well-documented families at that time. And certainly the family Turl is one of the most well-documented, in some cases clearly misunderstood as an early Sephardic Jewish family arriving to the Americas. The first of the family is Isaac Turl. Isaac Turl, who is a part of a large Sephardic family who were expelled from Spain, then on to Portugal, and then back to Spain. Isaac Turl arrives and would later become the first Hazan, overseeing the completion of the building of what is today bearing the family name Turl Synagogue. That synagogue is completed for Hanukkah, December 2nd, 1763. But it's Isaac Turl and the family that are living and are growing and really expanding and exercising the Jewish faith in Amsterdam. In fact, we found now a copy of Isaac Turl's actually bar mitzvah records from 1751. He's a part of the Portuguese synagogue, and from there, he's learning and growing and becoming a spiritual reader, and we're finding him both in Amsterdam and then later in Jamaica and then eventually to Newport. What's most important is that the Turl family, their origins and the Turl name are very Spanish. In fact, to this day, there's a small village in Galicia, Spain called Turl. And Isaac Turl's family had originated from there and then on to Amsterdam, to Jamaica, and then eventually to Newport. What's most important is at the time of Isaac Turl's arriving in Newport, he is literally brought to Newport by many of the leading Jewish merchants who felt that this is a time to have a permanent place of worship. Many of these early Jewish merchants had a foothold in New York, Newport, Philadelphia, Charleston, Jamaica, Barbados. But more importantly, they felt strongly that Newport would be the place where they would particularly grow and prosper. One of the most important families to arrive is Moses Michael Hayes and the Hayes family. Moses Michael Hayes, his father Judah Hayes, arrived from Amsterdam to New York, is a principled, prominent member of Sherith Israel in New York. His son, he is naturalized in New York. His son, Moses Michael, is born in New York and naturalized in New York. But Moses Michael, like a number of young Jewish men of the merchant class during the mid-18th century, are looking to Newport. Newport is the place to arrive. You can make money, you can build wealth, and there's a stable Jewish community with our own place of worship, our own burial ground, and our own community. But it's on July 11th, 1776, 1 week after the Declaration of Independence, in Newport, you have a group of colonial leaders, elected officials, who make a determination led by a merchant named Metcalfe Bowler, a fellow Newport merchant, later to be a Tory and a spy for the British Crown. But at that time, on July 11, 1776, Metcalfe Bowler and others had devised a list of 55 Newport merchants, including 12 Jewish merchants, and the spiritual reader, Isaac Turrell, and decided that they might not be loyal to the American Revolution, and they were required to come before them and sign a declaration of loyalty to the colony of Rhode Island and a loyalty under the new Declaration of Independence and Separation of Great Britain. Moses Michael Hayes wrote a letter saying he would refuse to sign this declaration of loyalty for several really important points. One, the fact that this loyalty was written and was to confirm that you would swear your loyalty under the true faith of a Christian. The second, Moses Michael said, I have no idea who has made this accusation to me, and I should have that person stand in front of me and judge me face to face. What Hayes had done at that time, which is extraordinarily important, is he exercised his right as a religious minority, naturalized American, and should not be compelled to sign any oath of loyalty without having his accuser face him, and more importantly, without having to sign any oath outside of his belief in his religion as a Jew. Because of the stand that he took, the true faith in Christian was stricken from the record where he would sign, and eventually he would sign and move forward. But what he did was to exercise his rights as a religious minority at a time of revolution. And what Moses Michael Hayes was doing was not in a vacuum, because other fellow merchants had this discussion, had this concern. While they had arrived in Newport as early as the mid-17th century, they had prospered in Newport, they had worshiped freely, they had built their own place of worship, which today, which is Turrell Synagogue, it exists as the oldest existing Jewish house of worship in America. They were still concerned with the fact that the Rhode Island Constitution and now the pending new United States Constitution would still have restrictions based upon religion. And in that fact, on August 17th, 1790, Moses Michael Hayes and other Jewish leaders and merchants came together and with their president, Moses Satius, offered a letter to the newly arrived President of the United States, George Washington, and in that letter suggested that there's now an opportunity to build into and codify into our new country's constitution a complete removal of a religious test, that anyone to be an American, a fully participating American citizen, should not be required to have a religious test. And in fact, that famous letter to George Washington, who in turn responded in similar language, would state, to deprive, as we herein has been, the avowable rights of free citizens, and most importantly, that we would erect the majesty of a government which should bigotry to give no sanction to persecution, no assistance. Today, the First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, which guarantees freedom of religion, speech, press, assembly, and the petition was ratified on December 15th, 1791. The early Jews of Newport, Charleston, New York came together and exercised their rights that would positively influence one of the most important aspects and amendments of our Constitution that we still take for granted this very day. And as I said, and as I want to end, what we still have to this place in Newport is a complex history. It's an irony. It's Jewish persecution. It's African enslavement. But today, physically within our community, and the lectures and the tours and the stories that we offer, we begin to tell it from a perspective of shared spaces. From the very fact that the early settlement and foundings of places like Newport, Philadelphia, Boston, Charleston included men, women, and families who did not necessarily look like or worship like George and Martha Washington. And in fact, today in Newport, we proudly have the oldest existing Hebrew burying ground that still exists and the oldest existing African burying ground that still exists. It's a testament of shared spaces and a testament that the history of America is the history of all of us. So thank you for giving me this opportunity to do this in 15, 20 minutes, a lot of information in a short period of time. I look forward to answering any questions you might have. And now I'd like to give it back to my dear friend, Michael Steinberger. Michael?
Wow. Amazing, amazing. Thank you, Keith, and thank you, Paul, for another amazing, enlightening presentation. Really, thank you. Thank you so much. As I usually do at this juncture of our program, I once again would like to take a moment and make an appeal, one that I hopefully everyone will get and listen to. So while some of you do lend support, most seem to overlook the importance of supporting our work. So allow me to state the obvious. While these programs are offered to you free of charge, they are not free to produce. We spend a lot of effort, time, and money in bringing these programs to you for free. So I ask you to please get involved, and if possible, consider making a tax-deductible donation today, and I thank you. I also would like to introduce you to our amazing and successful educational journeys. These are unique, specially designed tour programs intended to bring the stories of SEFARAD to life. We have an 11-day Morocco tour departing on August 31st and a 10-day Portugal tour departing on November 4th. And just before we go into the Q&A, I would like to announce the formation of Jewish Heritage Alliance Educational Center. This is a new production by us where we will produce SEFARAD-related educational programming. We kick off this new program this June in collaboration with SAGE, the Center for Advancement of Jewish Education. We will be sending an email to advise you of how you can enlist or join those programs if you like. And now at this time, we will open up the forum for your questions. Please note that questions are not answered today. We will try and address them to you via email. And at this point, I turn it back to Isaac. Thank you again, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. And of course, Keith and Paul, both of you, bravo on an extraordinary presentation. A number of the comments say that. So we have some questions here, but before we start, I'd like to offer the opportunity to either, well, Keith, you went second. Is there anything you wanted to add? Or Paul, is there anything you wanted to add to each other's presentations before I go into some of the questions we have here?
I'm good with what Keith said.
Okay, great. Okay.
No, it's always a joy to follow Paul.
Okay, great. So let's see. The first question we have is one that has been with us before. It was asked in part one, Paul, but it's come up again, and I'm sure this is always in the background. I mean, you both have done a great job explaining the complexity of this issue within the Jewish communities. But do we have specifically, let's say in the American context, either in the Revolutionary period or in the Civil War period or in between, do we have cases where Jewish slave owners celebrate Passover with the theme of liberation that created tension or reflection, say, within Jewish families that did own slaves in this time period?
So to find that, we would have to find somebody's diary or somebody's letter where they said, I went to the Seder last night, and having grown up here in Richmond where we own 10 slaves, or having grown up in Charleston where we own 10, plus our plantation out where we own another 50, it dawned on me that there's something ironic about having slaves serving us at a Seder. No one's ever come up with that letter, that diary entry. We know the Jews celebrated Passover. We have records of shuls in Richmond, in Charleston, in Savannah, in Baltimore, all of which are slave cities, in New Orleans, small synagogues in Mobile, Alabama, synagogues in Mississippi, where, among other things, they are selling matzah. They are getting ready for Passover. They are having seders. They are reading the 10 Commandments. And of course, the 10 Commandments, and you want to go to Exodus 20, verse 2. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of that house of slavery or that house of bondage, depending how you want to pronounce, translate the last word. A later commandment says you can't make your slaves work on the Sabbath. The 10th commandment says you can't covet your neighbor's slave. And Exodus 21, which is the next chapter, is all about how you treat slaves, including how you sell your daughter into slavery. So the answer is that the ancient Jews are people of the ancient world where there is slavery in every known society in the ancient world. There is slavery in every part of Europe, in Africa, in Asia. Slavery is everywhere. So that's the Bible. Flash forward to the 19th century, to the 1820s, 30s, 40s, 50s. Jews who live in the South live in a world where there is slavery, and they accept it. They profit from it. They make money from it. They may not make as much money as the giant planters who own hundreds and hundreds of slaves or even 1,000 slaves. But this is the world that they're involved with. Now, as I said, some of them object to this. There is a very famous book about a fugitive slave named Peter Still, who escapes from the South because two Jewish merchants buy him and take him as their slave as they go on a business trip. And the business trip ends up in Ohio, where he's freed. So there are the occasional Jews who do this kind of thing, just as there are some Christians who do this kind of thing. But the irony seems to be not very well considered. And I suspect if we could go back to Iberia before Ferdinand and Isabella, if we could go back to North Africa, where Jews live, and remember, in pre-Catholic Spain, Jews have a lot of religious freedom. There are huge Jewish communities there. They own slaves. And I doubt that they're saying, gee, this Seder is ironic. Now, David Einhorn, the rabbi in Baltimore who flees to Philadelphia, he sees the irony. There's a rabbi in Chicago who is also a German Jewish Reform rabbi who is actively anti-slavery. They see the irony, but I don't think the Jews in the South did. Just as I might add that the Christians who went to church and listened to a discussion of the Sermon on the Mount, which said, "Do unto others as you would have them do unto you," didn't see any irony in going back to their slave-owning plantations. It's hard for modern people to understand this. It's simply hard for us to wrap our head around it. But as Americans, we have to, because whether we like it or not, it was the cause of the Civil War, of 650,000 Americans killing each other. It has troubled America since the Civil War. It continues to trouble America today. And the only way we're ever going to be a better country and we're going to be better people is if we confront our past. History is not pretty. It's just there.
Well, going to that, and thank you. I don't know, Keith, if you'd like to add anything. But we'll go right into the American Revolution. Speaking to that, did the revolution mark a turning point in how, I mean, you alluded to this, I think, Keith, as well, with the story of Moses Michael Hayes refusing to sign the oath until the language was stricken. But in a broader perspective, did the revolution mark a turning point in how Jewish Americans viewed themselves in relation to race or citizenship or social hierarchy?
I mean, it did. It did for all of us. I mean, for anyone at that time. But I think what's most important to recognize is that you look at the life of, say, Moses Michael Hayes. I mean, his wife is Isaac Turrell's sister, Raina. They marry. They're displaced from Newport after the American Revolution, British occupation. and they're landing in Boston. And at the time, really the only active, Jewish family at that time in Boston, living in the North End. What's fascinating is that his four daughters, two marry Moses Myers and Meyer Myers, two half brothers from New York, and two others remain unmarried, but all four repopulate by the early 19th century to Richmond, Virginia. And they're living their lives during the antebellum era in Richmond, Virginia, up until the time of the American Civil War for several generations. What's fascinating is that some of the remaining letters that are part of the American Jewish Historical Society between family members, even some of the Hayes women with Rebecca Gratz, who's a contemporary and probably a second cousin in Philadelphia, they're being criticized by their Southern Jewish family members of being too abolitionist, bringing their abolitionist principles from Boston to Richmond. And it becomes even more complicated because now you have, by the 1830s and 40s, the German Jewish arrivals, and they're now dominating the populations. And there's this now hypersensitivity between being a Sephardic American Jewish identity from New England and the North, and now having to merge within this newly arrived German Jewish identity from a foreign land, and navigating that within the powder keg of the antebellum South. So what you begin to see, which is fascinating to me, and again, based on what few primary sources we have, some diaries, some letters and such, what we begin to see, and I would suggest, is it's actually Jewish women at that time that provide a more descriptive understanding of navigating active, observant Jewish life in early America. And I'll defer to Paul on this, because I think with men, sometimes we embellish. We talk about wars we won and kingdoms we've conquered. Whereas when you look at the diaries and primary sources of the women, particularly Jewish women, they're really talking about keeping a kosher household, running a Hebrew school, maintaining Jewish identity and not outmarrying. So what I think is fascinating at that time is that it's almost a rise of Jewish women who are doing as much hard work maintaining Jewish identity despite being in an American South and despite being in the early and mid 19th century and being a very minority population. To me, that's where I think really merging Jewish identity and American identity come together. And they do it quite successfully because they keep the families intact. And in turn, the families keep their shul or their place of worship intact.
Let me add to that in a couple of ways. First, the revolution is a monumental change in American life and in Jewish life. I would argue, in fact, that the American Revolution is the most important event in world Jewish history, from the destruction of the temple until the Holocaust. That is to say, as coming out of the American Revolution, you have, for the first time in the history of the world, a country where Jews are equal. So, for example, the U.S. Constitution says that there will be no religious test for office holding. Mm. At the time, there are 8 state constitutions which say you have to either be a Christian or a Protestant to hold public office. But the Philadelphia Convention says anyone can hold public office. And in fact, Jews do hold public office at the federal level from the very, very beginning. In addition, you have in George Washington's army 1 full colonel, a couple of lieutenant colonels, and a whole bunch of majors and captains. Now, that may not seem like a very big deal, except that, by the way, a full colonel is the 3rd highest rank in the army, because the highest is only a 2-star general. But this is the only army in the entire Atlantic world where Jews are officers. And no one ever questions the authority of a Jewish officer telling a Christian soldier what to do. This is a remarkable change. Thomas Jefferson goes to France as a diplomat, and his chief of staff is a Jewish man from Philadelphia. So here you have the author of the Declaration of Independence, who is a leading American diplomat, and who is he relying on? He's relying on this Jewish former lieutenant colonel from the army as his chief of staff. There are Jewish diplomats during the American Revolution and immediately afterwards. This is a unheard of change. One quick contrast to this. In England, no Jew could become a lawyer until the 1830s. There are Jewish lawyers in America as soon as the revolution is over. There are Jewish judges in the United States in the early 1800s. There are Jews elected to state legislatures when they change the rules, and there are Jews elected to Congress. Again, I mentioned Charles Levin, elected to Congress in the 1840s. At this time, a district in London is electing Lionel Rothschild to Parliament, but Parliament won't seat him. By the time he finally gets seated, there have been a handful of Jewish members of the House of Representatives and 2 U.S. senators who are Jewish. This is an enormous change for Jews. The second piece, of course, I completely agree with Keith, that the evidence we have of day-to-day Jewish life comes mostly from diaries and letters between dear sister, letter going back, my dear sister, my dear aunt, my dear niece, that women are doing this kind of communication. I think by and large, probably in the 19th century, although many men kept diaries, women were more likely to keep diaries. And so we get this kind of, excuse me, we get this kind of personal stuff. By the way, in there's a recently published diary of a Jewish woman named Mordecai in Richmond. The book is about this thick. It's a big, thick diary. In her diary, she rants and complains about the fact that the U.S. Army is now in Richmond and there are black soldiers in uniform, and she can't deal with it. She is a diehard Confederate slave-owning Jewish woman who totally objects to the idea, and she uses kind of racist comments about these soldiers. The Myers family that you've talked about is an incredibly wealthy Richmond family, and they own slaves, but they also prosper. And by the way, I just went through 2 of the Myers family business records. Their business books are at American Jewish Archives in Cincinnati. Literally 2 weeks ago, I was there reading these books, and they list all the things they're shipping, and they're shipping cotton, and they're shipping tobacco, and they're shipping other goods that are made by slaves, and they're bringing clothing in that slaves will wear from New England. They are involved in this very large slave-based economy. They're not shipping slaves. I found it very interesting. I don't see any consignments where they're, say, selling slaves from Richmond to Mobile or to Corpus Christi or to New Orleans, but they're certainly involved in this economy.
Thank you for that. See a couple of questions here. Keith also alluded to it, but kind of in this whole period from the Revolution again to the Civil War. Let's see, the first question is, were there differences in how Ashkenazi and Sephardi Jews experienced or engaged with these conflicts? And the second one is closer probably to the Civil War period. How did anti-Semitism, if at all, interact with both pro-slavery or abolitionist discourse in 19th century America?
I would just say from the colonial era, and we look at the Newport experience, which is very much similar to the New York experience at that time. First of all, there's an equal mix of Sephardic and Ashkenazi Jews during the colonial era. They're not all Sephardic and such. They follow certain traditions. But more importantly is that they're really following the custom of that time. And if they're merchant traders and the most prosperous trade economy is tied to the transatlantic trade, then they're centered around that. One of the great ironies, as I've said in Newport at that time, is not only Jews' participation in the slave trade, but the significant number of Africans participating in the slave trade. In fact, Newport merchants, both Christians and Protestants, participated in what was uniquely called the black trade, meaning Newport merchants landing on the West African coast, trading at places like Cape Coast Castle in today Ghana, Fort William, Elmina. They're not trading with European agents. They're trading directly with Fanti coastal leaders. In fact, they're literally transferring hogshead barrels of rum for enslaved men, women, and children. And you have Fanti leaders who are hiring or engaging Ashanti warriors to march inland in the African continent, raid villages, bring back enslaved men, women, and children to the waterfront, and there transfer to Fanti leaders who would sell to waiting Newport merchants, both Protestant and Christian, this black trade. It is such a lucrative trade and such a complex trade. When Africans become free and organized in Newport in 1787, the Africans in Newport send a letter to free Africans in Boston, Philadelphia, New York, and Providence, Rhode Island saying, we got to stop this black trade. There are too many of us who are serving on slave vessels as navigators and as negotiators and translators, and there are too many of us that are complicit in this trade. So it's important to recognize that when we talk about the horrors of a transatlantic slave trade of 12.5 men, women, and children over 3.5 to 4 centuries, it's important to recognize it existed, it succeeded because nearly every race, religion, or ethnicity and country participated, some more than others. And it all played out in Newport at that time. So my general sense is that early on, before the end of the American Revolution, before the American Civil War, you now have, because of these minority populations by race and by religion, ethnicity, they're pushing the envelope of this new United States. They're saying, look, we are here also, we've contributed also, but we've also suffered by religious persecution, by racial enslavement persecution. If we're going to make this a better America for all, you have to hear what we're saying. So my general sense is it's these religious and racial minorities that are best expressing and advancing the ideals of American freedom that, again, we still take for granted this very day.
Let me just add one thing about the direct question about anti-Semitism. Politics in America, especially in the era leading from the Revolution to the Civil War, is a pretty rough practice. People say nasty things about their opponents. And so you get elections in Philadelphia, for example, where a Jew, there's one guy running for office named Israel, and pretty hard to deny what his ethnicity is. And his opponents, refer to him as the Jew. They play the anti-Semite card. It doesn't work very well. It doesn't happen that you get defeated because you're Jewish. But sure, people say nasty things. What's most fascinating is that there is virtually no identifiable legislation anywhere attacking Jews other than these early state constitutions, which are very hard to amend because amending state constitutions are hard, that limit office holding to Christians or to Protestants. Rhode Island has a really interesting law because in 1798, Rhode Island passes a law saying that you can't open your business on Sunday. And they specifically apply it only to people whose Sabbath is on Sunday. In other words, it's one of the few laws I've ever encountered where Jews get a break, that they can open their business on Sunday because they're not Sunday worshipers.
And
so
Paul,
that's
that's
one
called
thing.
interdependence. I'm glad you raised that. That's the interdependence. I mean,
Yeah.
the-
And it's unique. I've never encountered it anywhere else. But there are also, of course, the anti-slavery movement is mostly Protestant. There are very few Catholics. At the time, America is probably 90% Protestant. And so there are some abolitionists who, they live in fear of the Pope. They live in fear of Catholics. They say nasty things about Jews. Judah P. Benjamin, who is the senator from Louisiana, makes one speech after another defending slavery. And a U.S. senator, an anti-slavery senator from Ohio, Benjamin Wade, refers to him as an Israelite with Egyptian principles. Well, you know something? That's a great line if you're in a political debate with a Jew who's defending slavery. It's not necessarily anti-Semitic. The one anti-Semitic moment we get is in the Civil War when Grant orders the expulsion of Jews under his command. Jews in Paducah, Kentucky, immediately contact the War Department and say, what's going on here? The War Department does not reverse Grant because they think this is a Confederate hoax. They cannot believe that Grant would issue such an order. And only when Jews from Southern Illinois and Kentucky, some of whom knew Lincoln when he was a lawyer, get to Washington and show them the order, do they believe it? And then within 3 days, it's been countermanded. And that's really the only specifically anti-Jewish thing we can find by the federal government that's only focusing on Jews. There are other laws, the immigration quotas of 1924, which are terribly harmful to Jews, but they're also harmful to other people, you know, Eastern Europeans, Chinese, Koreans, Italians, Greeks. You know, they're nasty quotas. So that would be the answer. Yeah, there's anti-Semitism, and by and large, it's mostly ineffective, in part because of the position, say, of Washington in the letter to the Newport synagogue that Keith quoted.
Thank you for that and for the great overview. Let's see, a couple more questions. One is, after the Civil War, after slavery is abolished with the 13th Amendment in 1865, do Jewish communities engage in any collective reckoning, moral or historical, again, about their role in slavery? Is there any?
Immediately after the war, I haven't found any. Now, there are individuals who do. You know, there are individuals who help their former slaves on the road to freedom. But I haven't seen any Jewish communal saying, you know, as we do on Yom Kippur, they're not doing this, saying we have sinned. And by the way, probably most of them don't think they have sinned. Most of them are saying, you know, those damn Yankees came and took our slaves away from us. Like Solomon Cohen Jr.'s wife, who grew up in Philadelphia.
You know, the other way to look at it is that after the American Civil War, and by starting the end of the 19th into the early 20th century, most Jews arriving to America are not Sephardic Jews. So the Sephardic history, that early history, is largely not one that's generally recognized in such. And for most in New England, being a New Englander, we would like to conveniently have amnesia to the fact that early slave trading existed during the colonial founding period. We'd like to place that blame, that horror, that tragedy on our Southern friends during the antebellum era, the 19th century. So it's the combination of things that I think have suppressed this important history and story.
Thank you both. Let's see, one last question here. Again, complex history. You both have done, again, a great job exploring these nuances and subtleties in this conversation. So, you know, moving forward, and maybe advice for schools, for educational centers, institutions, Jewish communities today, you know, how do we balance, again, talking about Jewish history in early America from this time period alongside an honest reckoning, you know, of the Jewish community's moral choices regarding race and slavery and American history?
Let me take a quick shot at that, because I speak at lots of synagogues, and I'm always happy to come, you know, be a scholar in residence for a Jewish community center or for a synagogue. I think you do it with an honest, open, historical discussion like we've had today. It can be at the level for adults. It can be at the level for teenagers. It can be a lower level. The other thing, of course, is to tie it to what happens in the early 20th century, when mostly Ashkenazi Jews, although also many of the now well-placed descendants of the Sephardi community, particularly in New York and Philadelphia, take a major lead in the creation of the NAACP, in the creation of the civil rights movement. The leading lawyer for the NAACP in the late teens and early 20s is Louis Marshall, a Jewish lawyer from Syracuse. By the way, I'm a Syracuse University alum, and the main street where all the stores are, just down the hill from the university, is Marshall Street, named for him. People don't know that. So there's Louis Marshall, who is a major player in this new civil rights movement. The highest award the NAACP gives is the Spingarn Medal, named for a Jewish philanthropist, Joel Spingarn, who was one of the founders of the NAACP. So there is this Jewish-Black alliance that works very well from the early part of the 20th century, in many ways still today, but less today than it was then. And that's something else to teach. But it's also important to remember that when the Levitt brothers build Levitt towns in Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and New York, they won't sell to blacks. So, look, we Jews are products of the world they live in. And some of us bring the Jewish morality of treating strangers as guests. Remember, we were strangers in the land of Egypt, and some of us don't. But I think there's a lot to teach there. And the more you teach and the more you meet with people from other communities, sit down and have hard conversations. That's what we have to be doing. Look, we are a tiny minority. We need every ally we can find.
Indeed. Keith, any last words to add?
No, I agree. I agree with Paul. I think a lot of it has to do with my focus on civics education, but also hands-on cultural education to our youth. Again, in Newport, we have a Hebrew burying ground that dates back to 1677. We have brought in kids from all walks of life through that burying ground. But I can tell you something. When we bring Latino kids, Spanish-speaking kids, they come into that burying ground knowing little or having any interest in Jewish history or heritage. But when they walk through those gates and all of a sudden they're looking at names written in both Hebrew and Spanish, these kids, their eyes light up. That's by Poppy's name, Rivera, Lopez. Where did that name come from? You're telling me that people who spoke Spanish was in America in 1700s? All of a sudden, history feels like them, sounds like them, looks like them. We can take you to our African burying ground, and there's a whole section where enslaved and later free Africans whose last names are Rivera, Satius. And that opens up a whole new dialogue to the fact that people shared culture, they shared histories, they shared spaces 300-400 years ago. So my general sense is the more that we can present the factual history of the founding of America, and as Paul says, it's not all black and white, it's shades of gray, and you have to include the warts. But if you do it in proper context, and you do it from a position of education and knowledge, then we all come together, and we all succeed together.
Let me give one footnote to Keith. After the Civil War, the elected Secretary of State in South Carolina was Francis Lewis Cardozo, the son of a Jewish man and a free black woman who grew up in South Carolina. And in part, it's in the embrace that Jews have to make of our relatives who are not 100% of Jewish racial ancestry, but they are still our cousins.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Well, that's great.
Thank you, Keith.
Yeah. Thank you, Keith. Thank you, Paul. And in absentia, I'd also like to thank Rabbi Dr. Yehonatan Elazar Demota, who was with us in parts 1 and 2, collectively to the three of you for being panelists in this truly enlightening 3-part series on slavery, legacy, and modern reflections. We're grateful to each of you in the audience for having joined us as well. And in conclusion, as these 3 webinars have shown, understanding the complexity of these topics across time and space is really essential to grasping how history shapes our world today. The past continues to offer profound lessons, especially as we confront enduring issues in our global society, like anti-Semitism, racism, and the ongoing pursuit of freedom and justice. And so I encourage everyone to continue to reflect on these legacies, remembering that history and memory are not merely something to study. They beckon to each of us in every generation. We hope you'll join JHA for future webinars and events as we continue to explore the legacy of SEFARAD, which remains vibrant into the 21st century. Wishing all mothers, past and present, a happy Mother's Day. And to everyone, stay curious, stay engaged, take care. Thank you, and we look forward to seeing you next time.